Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowski Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. In 1933, as the Great Depression ground into its deepest chasm, Franklin Delano Roosevelt pushed through a radical reorganization of the nation's moribund financial system and was said to have saved capitalism in 8 days. 75 years later, facing the most serious financial implosion since that time, the most conservative Republican administration in our lifetime went even further. Taxpayers are poised to become investors in our nation's largest surviving banks in an attempt to restart the credit markets that provide the life's blood for our economy, both domestically and around the world. It's a topsy-turvy world, though it's not clear if the relevant Marx is Carl or Groucho. Bedrock American corporate names like Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, and even Merrill Lynch have disappeared overnight. Initial Bush administration proposals were to simply pump money into the financial system without getting much back, in essence nationalizing the risk while leaving any subsequent gain privatized. That left the untenable impression that some corporate entities were too big to fail, while millions of Americans losing their homes in the subprime mortgage mess were too little to save. The final rescue package, totaling upwards of $700 billion, left the government with the most direct involvement in the financial markets we have ever seen. It's like we went to sleep and woke up in Sweden. In the triumph of ideology over reality, the federal government had been moving away from regulatory schemes that had kept the economy from spinning out of control since the Depression, starting under Ronald Reagan, continuing under Bill Clinton, and reaching unheard of levels under George Bush. The mantra was to let financial institutions self-regulate. At the heart of the crisis is the credit markets, led by the interbank lending market, under which financial institutions move money amongst each other to keep the economy moving. It got to the point that banks would not even lend money overnight to other banks because they didn't know if they would exist tomorrow to pay it back. And with the economy dying on the ground, the immediate job was to resuscitate the patient, getting credit markets moving again. We're still heading into a prolonged and deep recession. Going up are unemployment, foreclosures, and mortgage rates. Going down are exports, the stock market many of us rely on for our retirement, and local tax collections that support the vast panoply of government services we have come to rely on. How can the next president or the next mayor provide affordable housing and other services in the face of the grim fiscal realities? We're joined by 4 prominent New Yorkers to try and figure out what it all means. Charles Brescher from the Citizens Budget Commission is the Executive Vice President and the Director of Research. Hakeem Jeffries is a state assemblyman from Brooklyn and a district senator in Fort Greene. Ann Cohen is a political science professor at Hunter College. And Bishop Mitchell G. Taylor is the president and CEO of East River Development Alliance, who has to figure out how to navigate the new realities to survive in the nonprofit world. Chuck, let me start with you. You look at these numbers as a job. Mm-hmm. What does this all mean for the city? What does it all mean for the state?
It's in no way is it good. It means that revenues are going to be less than we had been counting on. I mean, I say we, I mean the mayor and the governor and the respective legislative bodies who passed budgets earlier this year. Those budgets are quickly becoming not valid anymore. The revenue assumptions are proving too optimistic. I think that was predicted at the state level early on. The mayor was more cautious, but even his estimates, I think today he said he was bringing the revenue numbers down by about $500 million this year and $1 billion next year. So both those budgets are ultimately going to have to be balanced. They're going to have to be balanced pretty quickly. It means there's going to be a lot of adjustments, none of which are going to be pleasant, that are going to have to be made in city and state government.
Assemblyman, it appears that one of the losers in this whole thing may be the Republican presidential campaign. I mean, this obviously has political implications.
Well, I think the collapse of the financial markets and Wall Street happened on the watch of George W. Bush and the Republican domestic policies that he's been pushing for the last 7, 8 years. And so it's only natural, particularly because Senator McCain, in terms of his votes, has been so closely aligned with George Bush's economic policies, and in terms of the policies that McCain has been pushing as his agenda for the future moving forward, have been so closely aligned to the Bush policies that when the economy took this dramatic turn for the worst, it hurt McCain in a serious way.
Bishop, you provide a lot of services here in Manhattan, I believe, and when Chuck talks about budget cuts, that's going to impact the people that you serve.
Oh, certainly. The first people to really suffer the loss of this economic implosion are poor people, people that rely on social services and programs that are beneficial for economic mobility and sustainability. And when I think about what has happened on Wall Street and what's happening in the markets, these directly impact the people that support us, the private corporations, the foundations that get their money from the private corporations, and then of course city and state government as well. And so the effect of all of this will impact low-income people and people that depend upon the services that we provide every day to make their lives better.
And it's how did the presidential candidates? I mean, we talked a little bit about McCain. How did they react to this?
Well, it's been somewhat frustrating as a person who works with state and local budgets and the politics of adjustment to what other governments do, to listen to the presidential debates, because I think my answer to you, Bob, is they didn't. They've reacted to Joe the plumber. They've reacted to Main Street, to say to people, to quote a former president, I feel your pain, so that there is a sense that they're connecting with people, but it's a lot more complicated than that, as Chuck indicated and as Bishop did as well. When the national government has to cut back with either a hatchet or a scalpel, it's not going to matter a whole lot. That's going to have a direct impact on the funds that are flowing into state and local governments. And state and local governments, as Chuck said, don't have much of any place to go because they can't borrow money. Not to any great extent. They certainly can't borrow to cover their operating expenses. And so when that scalpel or that hatchet falls, we haven't heard much from the candidates about which programs they would protect and which programs they would look to for deeper cuts. We haven't heard about what we're going to do about the war in Iraq and the millions of dollars that it's costing us. So it's too long an answer, but I think basically they haven't been very specific.
I think they have debated the war in Iraq in the sense of the issue
right,
of,
but not as a financial issue as much.
Well, I think that Obama at least has talked about, I know I've heard him say a bunch of times, since they tend to have talking points and
yes,
say the same thing many times, that it's costing us $10 billion a month and the Iraqis are sitting on an $80 billion surplus. So he's trying to draw that explanation of the least,
That's right.
At least the financial cost.
He's also pointed out that the national budget deficit is growing much more rapidly now and is likely to keep growing. That's likely to constrain how much the federal government's going to be able to do to bail out the states and the localities. Another bailout. So,
Hakeem, you sit up in the legislature in Albany, and while we, certainly on a national level it's different because we have to balance our budget in ways that the federal government does not, but there's a large argument going on, being made partly, I think Obama is making this, but other people are as well, that this is the time for the government to prime the pump, that this is the time for the government to invest in infrastructure, that the government actually somebody needs to get the economy moving.
Well, I think an investment in infrastructure is exactly the right way to go nationally.
Even if it kicks up the deficit.
Even if it kicks up the deficit, one, because people are struggling, all across this country. We do need to jumpstart the economy with a massive investment that will benefit the people who are suffering. And at the same time, our nation's infrastructure is crumbling. You have bridges in great disrepair, highways that need to be built and or sustained and or repaired. And so I think you can accomplish two productive things at the same time. Rebuilding our infrastructure and infusing an investment in the economy that can help get us moving in the right direction.
Chuck, you look at capital funding all the time. I mean, this would be done through capital funding.
Yeah, I think it is a real tricky policy decision that if we have a federal stimulus package coming down the road, which we probably will because we'll need it, what form that takes. And one of the classic decisions is whether to do it in public works investments in this way or other mechanisms. We've had public service jobs which got a bad name back in the 70s under Carter with CETA and so on. We tend not to want to do it by creating jobs because they're associated with make work and leaf raking and stuff, though I think they could be used better. But the other option, what that we actually did in the last recession, was to pump money into the operations of state and local government to give budget relief. It was done, the principal mechanism was to increase the federal share of Medicaid. And they're talking about doing that now. And I think the case that's often made for doing it that way is just that it has an impact quicker. Trying to put money into public works, it takes time. You've got to decide which projects, plan the projects, you know, things. There's always delays in capital projects, so the money doesn't get spent as quickly. So it's often easier to just say, well, give the state some more money by paying for a bigger share of Medicaid. And then the question is really, do they just use it to help balance their budgets, and it's not really a stimulus or not. So there's some hard decisions to be made about how to do this economic stimulus program.
Do deficits matter?
I'm going to talk about state and local, and there they definitely
because
do, because you can often, the mayor can go to jail if he does it, but or at least the city will be back in the hands of
he loses control
the control board.
I mean,
but at the federal level, of course they matter. They have big macroeconomic effects and effects on international borrowing. So you got to worry about the deficit. Yeah.
What's your sense of this question? And I'm going to ask you because a lot of people you try to help might be getting these jobs. I mean, what's your sense of?
Well, I thought Chuck's response was very interesting because one of the issues in New York, of course, is that when the state pays a bigger share of Medicaid, so does the city. So that has impacts both ways. But if we were to get money from the federal government to reduce the amount that we have to pay for Medicaid, I'm curious what your best bet is that the state would do with it. I mean, is it really going to help the people who are really hurting? Is it going to rebuild our education system where the state promised us billions and we got
Bupkis,
Bupkis is what I was going to say.
I think it's the technical term.
That's the technical term.
Well, I think the state would use it to help with its budget value. It would, in effect, be cutting less than it otherwise would have to, and that's a stimulus of kinds. But the state's got a big problem. I think the last estimates are something like an $8 billion gap next year. Yeah. That's big money, on a base of state funds that's less than $80 billion or so.
What are you hearing?
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, it looks like we'll be going back.
You sit in those caucuses.
Yeah.
We'll be going back to Albany November 18th into special session to deal with this year's budget deficit, which estimates range from anywhere from a low of $1.2 billion to as much as $2 billion, which I think is what Patterson is projecting it at this moment. And then we're looking at a deficit next year in terms of the 2009-2010 budget, anywhere between $8 and $10 million.
$10 billion.
$10 billion. And the problem really, I mean, it's tied to a variety of things, but obviously the collapse of the financial sector in New York City, which is so intricately tied into our state revenues. 20% of our revenues in New York State come from Wall Street and the financial sector. And because Wall Street is so devastated, both in terms of some companies that no longer exist, those are corporate taxes that will no longer flow to the state. The bonuses are expected to be so much lower than they have been in the past. And then there's some jobs that are going to be non-existent. And if the jobs are non-existent, so is the income tax revenue. And so these are some troubling times. We're going to have to make some tough decisions, both in November and with respect to the budget next year.
I mean, how do you see this trickling down for one of, I mean, we're dealing with a group of students here who are pretty soon going to be entering the job market.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. We, in New York City, the New York City Housing Authority has 500,000 people that live in public housing. There's approximately 344 conventional public housing developments scattered around the 5 boroughs. The average income is $23,000 a year or less. And 11% of the people that live in public housing over the age of 25 have a bachelor's degree. So what we do, with residents that live in public housing, if you don't have to look far to find poverty. Public housing initially was meant to be a stepping stone. Now it's become geographically isolated properties, what I like to call segregated pockets of poverty. And when you consider that and you look at what's happening in terms of the budget cuts and the economic crises, the people that are going to be impacted the most are the people that we're helping every day with employment. We're dealing with the unemployed, we're dealing with the underemployed, helping those that are unemployed get jobs, those that are unemployed realize some career ladders. All of these initiatives that we foster are funded. And I think that when you look at the crises that we're facing, the first thing to go are direct service initiatives like ours.
How much do you, I mean, how dependent are you on corporate and foundation money?
Very, very dependent.
I mean,
very dependent.
50%?
In percentage, about 60%.
And so that's a great concern. It's, you know,
Yeah.
I mean, Bear Stearns, Lehman, Merrill Lynch were actually large funders of good works in the city.
They really were. And yeah,
they're not there.
Yeah, and we've already, many of our funders have already contacted us and told us already that there's going to be significant cuts in the allocations to us for 09 and 10.
And you can't expect
2010.
the public purse to pick up all of that money, I assume.
Yeah, no, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen.
You know, we're talking about public works, and you're talking about people in the housing projects. I grew up in Linden Houses and moved in 1957 when I was a reporter in 1987. I went back, it was the 30th anniversary, and I went to kind of go back and look. And at that point in the 1950s, they were opening up around 15,000 new New York City Housing Authority units per year. Mm-hmm. And starting in Ronald Reagan's time, when the whole philosophy of investment in direct investment in construction, they were literally, I remember one year there was 497 new units. So I mean, it's a very profound change to what the federal government does or can do in terms of, again, I hate to use the word trickle down, but that seems to be that. What does this election mean in terms of the, in your sense, in terms of the how we dig ourselves out of this?
Well, I have been teaching a class this semester on the presidency and presidential elections. And what I've told my class is that I think that this is one of the most significant elections of your lifetime and maybe all of our lifetimes. That we don't get sea changes in politics very often. It's not to say that it will happen this time, but I think the possibility is there. You have, in my opinion, a discredited presidential administration, and that is a discredited presidential administration that comes after many similar, philosophically similar presidential administrations. And so if Barack Obama wins this election, I think he has an opportunity to present a new vision. Right now, I don't know for sure what that would be. I mean, I have a sense, I think maybe everybody watching and sitting in the audience here has a sense that there are significant differences between the two candidates.
But just the way, Hakeem, you're talking about how you guys are going to have to trim your sails because of the budget problems. The next president is going to be hamstrung by the current financial,
right.
And they wouldn't, neither one would answer the question, what are you going to cut back?
But pick up on what you were talking about. The state of New York has the biggest gap between the rich and the poor in this country. The top 20% compared to the bottom 20% in terms of income make 8.7 times more. That's the biggest difference in the country. And what we're hearing, and I think this is a legacy of funding philosophy, is that we've got to be very careful about how we raise taxes, about how we tap into that wealth. But the reality is that by pursuing the policies that we have had, we've allowed that gap to get bigger and bigger and bigger, not just in New York, but everywhere. So I think this is terribly important.
Has the governor boxed himself in a little bit on taxes? Because he's talking about not raising taxes.
Yeah, and this is going to be something that I think has to be on the table in the November special session. We in the Assembly in August passed a surcharge on millionaires. We left alone the first $1 million, but on any subsequent $1 million that's received an income, we increased the marginal tax rate. I think it would have generated an additional $1.5 billion. We passed that bill in the Assembly. The governor was opposed to it, and the state Senate is opposed to it. And I think we're going to have a real debate in terms of how we deal with where we're at financially, and not just cut, but possibly look at how we bring in additional revenue. In the aftermath of September 11th, I wasn't in the legislature at the time, and we were dealing with the financial crisis at that moment. There was an income tax surcharge that was added to income in excess of $250,000. And an argument was made at that time that people would flee the city. It would send the city in a downward spiral. None of those dire predictions came true. In fact, we've had a pretty successful last 4, 5, 6 years. And I don't think that if we were to raise the income tax surcharge on millionaires, those who can afford just to do a little bit more to help out New Yorkers who are in trouble, that you're going to see a bunch of millionaires fleeing to Idaho or Utah or South Dakota. I think they'll remain right here in our city, and they'll contribute to our general well-being.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, two things. One, just a modest way. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I think actually the bill that passed in the Assembly did not leave alone everybody under $1 million. It actually lowered the taxes slightly, but it lowered the taxes for people under $1 million, which I think some people found hard to swallow, given that we're trying to address a problem now. And yes, you may want to tax the rich more, but to combine that with lowering was something of a populist appeal to it. But I don't think that's ultimately going to pass. It was a one-house bill.
And a populist appeal that will be damaging revenue at a time when the state desperately needs revenue.
Yes. So, but I do think it's right, right both as an accurate prediction and probably right as policy, that we're not going to balance the city and the state budgets and deal with these multi-billion-dollar gaps entirely by cuts. We are likely to have some tax increases, and it is very important to think about the nature of those increases and what we want to do with tax policy. At the at the state level, it's quite right. We have a history of passing temporary income taxes that to deal with this, and that's widely perceived as a fair way to do it if it's necessary. I don't think it ought to be the first resort, but those gaps are pretty big, and we may be talking about the revenue side as well as spending. At the local level, the mayor has already assumed that we're going to do a 7% property tax increase next year.
Technically, he's going to end the property.
No, technically, he's going to raise taxes 7%. They set the property tax every year. He likes to say he's taking away a cut, but every year they set the tax rate, and next year they're going to set it 7% higher. But he's now talking about actually doing it mid-year because he thinks he needs the money, and that will be a debate that probably happens after the term limit vote, but it will be a debate that takes place. And I think that's, across the board, property tax increases are probably not the best way to go. We have a very strange and distorted property tax in New York City that has these 4 different classes of property, and we very much favor smaller owner-occupied property, and we disfavor or tax more heavily rented properties, and it's very inequitable from an economic point of view, but it tends to be the people who are in owner-occupied housing who vote more, are more vocal in the city council, and I think they get a favorable treatment in a way that doesn't make a lot of economic sense. And I think it would be better to fix that than to just do across-the-board tax
As somebody
increases.
who lives in Class 2 housing in an apartment, I actually can see the benefits of lower taxes on single-family homeowners because I think that the lower property taxes is one of the things that keeps people from leaving the city. If you look at the same house on one side of the Nassau-Queens border as opposed to a house on the other side of the Nassau-Queens border, you may be paying $4,000 in taxes here and paying $15,000 for exactly the same house. So even though I'm kind of a left-leaning apartment dweller, I actually can see some of the rationale. It's not. It may be irrational economically, but policy is more than economics.
But it's not just you who's suffering from that. There are a lot of disproportionately many more low-income people rent than own their house. And it's not a fair policy. Yeah.
Sometimes I don't like. I don't like to have my preconceptions messed with, but that's how life is sometimes. So, taxes are never popular.
No, they are not.
And one of the things among the attacks coming from the McCain campaign is it tries to find something to attack that works. I think they're having a hard time getting leverage, obviously. is accusing Obama of wanting to raise taxes, even though I think he doesn't, and they've even called him a socialist. Do these things are these echoes of 1950s? I mean, where is this? I mean, where is this coming from?
Well, I think that presidential campaigns always try to reach out and touch people, either stroke them and make them feel good if you want them to vote for you, or scare them if you want them not to vote for your opponent. But I think what has been said here before is what we have to keep in mind, that there is going to be a need for revenue. We're going to have to face that. And what happens after the election is not necessarily going to be determined by what is said before the election.
That's a shocking comment.
I know it is. I know it is. That's why I'm a cynic. But you know, it is the fact that everybody's going to have to sit down and look at the realities. And really, I think one of the important things to keep in mind is that the state and local governments have the hardest taxes to raise. Chuck mentioned the property taxes. When you get your bill and you have to pay your property tax, that hurts, right? And people yell at you when that happens. If you change the income tax because of the withholding rate, people don't like it, but it's not as directly painful. Would you agree with that, Chuck, or are you going to?
No, I think that it's pretty well established that across the country, the property tax is probably the most unpopular tax, and it's very much related to the facts, at least for people who own their home, it's a very visible tax. You do get that bill, or you see it in your mortgage payment. It gets adjusted every year when it happens, so people are very concerned about that. The others, you know, the sales tax, it's kind of gradually when you live your life over the course of the year, and the income tax, as you say, there's withholding. But people who make estimated payments maybe see it a little more visibly. But I think the basic point's right. It's because it's visible, so highly visible, that it becomes so unpopular.
Well, the property tax also is one of the most regressive taxes that we have, and the sales tax is real close.
Yeah. Bishop, I want to keep you out of trouble. You're a nonprofit, and you know nothing about politics. Is that correct? Do you follow this tax debate? Do you enter this tax debate?
Yeah, I follow it, and it's inevitable that revenue has to come from somewhere, and I think that both of the candidates are going to have they have a real big challenge to find the revenue and appease the people at the same time. That's almost impossible. The thing that troubles me the most is where do people that live in low-income tracts, where do they live after this? You know, where are the affordable housing? We have approximately almost 3,000 units of affordable housing in NYCHA's database with 131,000 people on an 8-year waiting list. What are we going to do with those people? Where are these people going to live? And I think
because people are not moving on because there is no available housing outside NYCHA.
There's no there's no available housing, and I think that, you know, the further disinvestment in public housing is just going to perpetuate the problem, and we continue to see these budget gaps, and these municipalities are going to be strapped. There's no way to expand and create more affordable housing. So I think that it's the high price of being poor that someone has to really look at today.
One of the more remarkable statements that got a good deal of coverage in the press was going back to your comments before about the unpopularity of the Bush administration and the degree to which the Bush administration is an albatross around John McCain's neck. There was a McCain guy who said that if we talk about the economy, we lose, and you have these other issues that they're trying to throw into the pot. Yeah. But the economic troubles, it seems, are so incredible, so unprecedented in our lifetime that doesn't get any traction.
Yeah, I think there's been a series of statements that have either come from the candidate himself, Senator McCain, or from of his closest advisors that have created problems for him. And the candidate himself said that the fundamentals of the economy were strong. One of his closest advisors, Phil Gramm, who he subsequently had to disassociate himself from, said that, you know, Americans are a bunch of whiners for the anxiety that they were feeling about the economy. 1 month later, the economy
somebody who worked for
complete collapse.
As somebody who worked for Jimmy Carter, who got politically murdered for saying that we were in a malaise. I particularly liked Phil Graham's comment.
Yeah, and I mean, as difficult as it will be for the next president, whoever that may be, but if it's Senator Obama, to move the country in a different direction, I think one thing that was mentioned by the professor is clear. The current philosophy has been so widely discredited that there is nowhere to go but up. I mean, if you think about the tragedy in terms of where we're at internationally in the failed war in Iraq, and 4,000 Americans who've lost their lives, the tens of thousands of Americans who are permanently injured, no arm, no leg, no hand, no foot, $10 billion per month that is being spent over there, and then the economy is in collapse here at home. Millions of Americans without health care, folks losing their homes all over the country. I mean, in terms of where we're at, I think Obama at least has an opportunity to make a compelling case for adopting a different set of policies to take us in a different direction.
I'm going to go to a question, but just one very basic example of how the economic problems have probably shut down one Republican talking point, which is the argument of turning Social Security into privatized accounts and investing them in the market, and the degree to which Social Security, starting in the Great Depression, has driven geriatric poverty way down by providing a floor for poor people. If senior citizens had their money invested in the market right now, this problem would be profoundly worse. I'm going to tell us your name, tell us your campus.
Good evening. My name is Christian Bermudez. I'm from John Jay College. My question is directed to Bishop Taylor. As I'm sure you know that 1 in every 4 residents of the New York City Housing Authority does not have access to financial services, to banks or credit unions. How is this affecting our economy, and what is the New York City Housing Authority doing to address this issue?
Well, I can't speak for the New York City Housing Authority in terms of what they're doing, but I can speak to the mainstream financial institutions. I grew up in Queensbridge, and one thing I realized when I was a kid, the only icon that I had for financial services was a check casher. And right next door to the check casher was a liquor store. And that's commonplace in most public housing neighborhoods in New York City. One of the things that we set out to do when we started the Alliance was to bring a bank to 21st Street near the public housing development. And we had some town halls, we had some meetings, we gathered signatures for petitions, and the final thing we did was we had a march. We led a march down 21st Street, down the main thoroughfare of Long Island City with about 500 or 600 people, educators, elected officials and navigators in the community, children, marching under the banner of economic justice on Martin Luther King's celebrated birthday 2.5 years ago. And that got a lot of attention. The result of that is that we were able to get our area designated as a banking development district, and that allows banks to come into a low-income tract, not depend upon the depository of the neighborhood to be solvent, but at least they have a mainstream financial institution.
One of, another point, talking about regulation, is one of the regulations that has remained in effect is the Community Reinvestment Act, which requires financial institutions to invest some of their money in poor neighborhoods that had been redlined in the past. And, again, when we talk about an environment in which the government has said to financial institutions, do whatever the hell you want, and, deregulated, and we're now bearing the burden of the lack of wisdom of that decision, what investment has come in, private investment has come into poorer communities, I think is in large part dependent on that community reinvestment. I don't know if you're familiar with the way it works.
No, I don't want to claim any expertise on evaluating that act.
So, but it's again, it's a form of regulation that was there.
Can I speak to that for a minute?
Yes.
This is a very good point. One of the things that I found fascinating in the context of this presidential election, and some of the apologists for the failed economic philosophy, folks were pointing to the anti-regulators were actually pointing to the Community Reinvestment Act and blaming that for the collapse of Wall Street in 2008, even though the Community Reinvestment Act was put into effect in the late 70s. And so it shows you the extent to which folks are reaching in order to defend what I think you know, even Stevie Wonder can see is a failed philosophy.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name's Catherine Zidane. I'm a student at Hunter College. Presidential candidate Barack Obama has proposed establishing an Office of Urban Policy to articulate a comprehensive vision for urban America. What areas do you think that office should focus on? Perhaps more information about urban markets? Is it going to be a homeland security concern? I'm interested in the panelists' opinions.
You want to tackle that? As a Hunter College student?
Actually, and one whom I greatly respect, that is an excellent question, and I think Barack Obama has actually said that he has some priorities that are very closely aligned with developing urban policy, and he certainly knows whereof he speaks, given his experience in Chicago.
However, it seems to me that cities, as we have said in the last however many presidential elections, are almost invisible as an issue in the public debate. I mean, you know, I was not even aware, for instance, that Obama has talked about this particular office. Cities are, you know, I don't mean Sarah Palin talking about un-American, you know, about American parts of the country and un-American parts of the country. That's her problem, and hopefully it's not our problem. Are cities unpopular politically? I mean, it just amazes me that 80% of the
cities are
country.
A given. Cities are a given politically. So you're not going to win a presidential election by crafting an appeal to cities. You have to kind of cast this big umbrella to Joe the plumber, you know, for want of a better icon.
We have plumbers in the city. Yeah.
Absolutely, we do. But so does
Can't
everybody.
Get one, but
That's the whole point. But I think Catherine's question is really a good one, because we've had the comment about infrastructure, that infrastructure in our cities is in terrible condition. You all know the situation with transportation here, and we're terribly dependent on it if we are going to do well. Electric grids, I mean, the problems are not just in New York City, but they are across the country. Because cities have been invisible, we've not been investing in them. And we've not been investing in the people in cities as well. The human capital in cities is grossly underdeveloped. And that is human capital that used to make cities growth poles, that used to make them places where businesses came to locate because they had highly qualified people to work in them.
Yes, sir.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Carlos Favara, and I'm studying at Brooklyn College. I'm also interning at Hiram Montserrat's district office in Queens. And I'd like to ask Hakeem if he could shed some light on the fact that Hiram is going to be going to the Senate and is running unopposed on November 4th, just a couple of days from now. As a citizen, I'm perplexed by the situation that no other party and no other individual in the city would come forth and challenge him. And in all honesty, I'm tempted to do that myself.
Well, I think that, you know, part of the issue in Hiram's district, as is the case in the district that I represent, Fort Greene, Clinton Hill, Prospect Heights, Crown Heights, Bedford-Stuyvesant, is that it's a largely Democratic district. And so, you know, the real action is in the primary. And because Hiram Montserrat didn't have a primary opponent, he was actually challenging the incumbent city council person, John Sabini.
The senator, the former councilman.
Right, the incumbent senator, John Sabini. And Sabini decided to accept the job with the Patterson administration. Then he was left without an opponent in both the primary, and really there's no meaningful opportunity for a Republican or an independent to win that seat in the November general election.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is John Shearer. I'm a student at Queens College, and my question is directed to, I guess, the entire panel. Do you think that the Electoral College unfairly represents Americans living in cities? And if so, do you think that's a reason that discourages people living in cities to vote?
The electoral, I happen to have I was once a member of the Electoral College, almost, but I was living in Seattle and I ran, and if Jimmy Carter had won Washington State, and I was going to vote for my mother for vice president because my mother was really upset at me, but I didn't get the chance to cast the vote. I happen to think that the Electoral College is actually the model for how presidential elections should be. I happen to think that that electoral vote should be handed out based on each congressional district, as 2 states now do. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is so that presidential candidates have an incentive to campaign everywhere in the country. You can get 2 for your Senate, 2 for your senators, and then 1 for each congressional district. Nebraska and Maine do that now. And so I happen to think that the Electoral College is a very bizarre anachronism dating back to a time when you didn't want the unwashed masses to have quite as much say about who would be better among us. But I actually think that California, there were Republicans in California who tried to do that this time, but that was just to undo the Democrats. That was just to seize a cheap advantage. You didn't see them wanting to do that in Texas. But if it could be done on a national level. Does anybody have any thoughts on the Electoral College? I actually thought about the Electoral College.
Yeah, but part of the question was whether the way it works discourages people from voting, and I'm not all that up on it, and I would defer to Professor Cohen, but I don't think that that because of the way it works, people say, oh, my vote doesn't count that much, and therefore I don't vote. I think that turnout is a function of a lot of other things, and not it varies within the structure of the given electoral college. But
yeah, if people voted only as urban residents or non-urban residents, you're probably right, especially since cities have declined as people have moved to the suburbs in terms of dominance of population. But that's not really the way people vote. So the state of New York probably has as much disincentive for people to vote. I mean, what is Obama ahead here by 30-some points? So
well, if Obama had trouble in New York, the election is over. It's like if a Republican had trouble in Utah.
Right, but that's the kind of thing that's more likely to depress the vote. But frankly, I don't think that's going to happen either.
Yeah, I do think that it's an interesting question in that it was very troubling for a lot of folks, myself included, that Al Gore, the vice president at the time, could win the national popular vote. More Americans went to the polls that November to vote for Al Gore, and yet George Bush is our president because of the way the Electoral College system works. Now, it would take a constitutional change in order to move in a different direction. It's a very complex question, but I certainly think that it is reasonable to think about, because it's difficult for a lot of people to absorb the notion that the person who got the majority of votes is actually not the president of the United States.
There's a statue. I live on 112th Street near Riverside Drive now, and there's a statue of Samuel Tilden right outside my window. I have the best view of his backside in the city, and he's the last one in 1876 who got more popular votes and lost the election. I do think one of the good things of an electoral college system, maybe the one I want, but if you had a sheer popular vote and you had a close election, you would have chaos in however many tens of thousands of election districts around the country, as opposed to where you could focus in on where they're close. So I think that as a
you mean because of
that, in other words, if you had a very close election,
yeah.
What happened in Florida would be happening in tens of thousands of election districts where every single vote could be fought over. We might not have an election. We might not have a president elected, until 4 years later. So I mean, it's a very complicated question. It's worth a different show. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening. My name is Ms. Dolina Duzan, and I attend Medgar Evers College. My question is to the state legislator. Now, I know taxes are going to be raised, and whoever gets taxed, these monies generated from the taxes that you're going to raise, will they be able to offset some of the social service programs, such as Bishop Taylor's, that's going to be cut due to this economic downfall, especially when you go to special sessions on November 18th?
Well, I think part of the desirability in terms of looking at tax increases and really moving toward a more progressive tax system in New York State is so that we don't have to reduce spending to devastate programs like those run by the bishop or others, particularly in this time of economic distress, where working families and low-income folks and middle-class people are already in a difficult situation. And so, what my argument, I know that of many of my colleagues, is going to be is that we should look at more progressivity in the tax structure to bring in additional revenue so that we don't have to take a hatchet to some social service programs that are very important to the people in New York City.
But are you, in this kind of a fiscal environment, you are looking at cuts, and the question is where those cuts take place.
Absolutely, and there's going to be a big struggle that's going to be fought, particularly in the area of public education. I think the state public education budget this year to the school districts throughout the state is about $21.4 billion. And when we went into special session in August, we didn't touch education spending. But as the governor has indicated, everything is on the table, and it certainly is going to be an issue that's going to be under discussion.
With 2 kids in public school, I'll watch that debate. Yes.
Hi, my name is Melissa Kristick. I'm from John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and my question was more about the city. Since Mayor Bloomberg is a big advocate for better urban policies, what do you think that the next mayor would have to do to follow his lead or improve on it if he doesn't get his term limit extended?
I mean, what's the next mayor going to face, whether it's Bloomberg or anybody else?
Well, as we're talking at the national level, that the distress in the economy is going to create a pretty unpleasant situation for whoever's the incumbent. I think that's going to be the case. There's not going to be a lot of loose money around as there has been in boom times. So the next mayor is going to have to figure out how does he manage the city better. We've had one of the things Mayor Bloomberg has done is increase spending pretty substantially. He's increased taxes along the way as well. We've come to think of the city as a good place, and services have gotten better as well. It's not that I want to argue that money's wasted, but there probably could be more attention to managing the city better. And in particular, I think the things that have been called the uncontrollables in the budget, that the mayors tend to say, this is why I have to increase taxes. We really need some things aren't uncontrollable. They just may not be able to deal with them this month in this year's budget. But over the long term, you can control just about anything. And so things that haven't been turned to, but the pension system for public employees, which is going to take a big hit because of what's happened in the stock market. Now, the people's pensions aren't in jeopardy. It means the taxpayers have to put more into the pension funds when the investment returns go down. I think over the long run, we're going to have to look to a less expensive for the taxpayer pension system, and that gets dealt with in what's called Tier 5. Anybody who's working for the city now or is currently a retiree is not going to have their benefits reduced. Those are protected by the state constitution. But the way in which we try and control the costs of the public retiree systems over time is to change the benefit structure for the people who were hired new. So people come on knowing what the game is going to be. We don't punish people retroactively. And that we've done it 4 times, so there are now what's called 4 tiers in the public pension system in the city and the state. And I think one of the things the next mayor is going to have to do is go to the legislature and work with the legislature to create Tier 5. We're just not going to be able to afford the same kind of pension system as the city has been able to provide in the past. That's one real challenge.
Just a quick question. I used to know this when I covered the budget in City Hall. Has the mayor, in fact, salted away a rainy day fund that we are living off of in part?
Yeah, we're living off it today. He's going to roll a little bit of it into next year. It's going to be less now because the problem gets worse every day. We have had a bigger de facto rainy day fund under the mayor that he's built up than we have it certainly at the state level, and that previous mayors haven't built up this kind of rainy day fund either. So that has worked. It's been a big cushion this year. It would have been a lot worse, but it's we're going to exhaust it. It is not going to get us through these next couple of years. Mm-hmm.
Yes, ma'am.
Liz Soto, John Jay College. Healthcare access is an issue that has been raised by both candidates, and I was wondering which of the 2 policies, if any, is closest to meeting the economic needs of urban society.
Well, isn't that what an election is about? Do you want to? I mean, it seems that they're 2 very profoundly different plans. That what Senator Obama is talking about is that if you have a current health plan, you can keep it. If you don't, he's going to essentially require you in one way or another to kind of tap into the, he's going to make available the federal health care plan, and that companies that do not provide health care will have to pay some kind of a fine or a fee. in order to offset some of that cost. He's in essence reinforcing the employer-based healthcare system. McCain is taking a much more hands-off, kind of deregulated, if you will, point of view, saying I'm going to give everybody a $5,000 voucher, in essence, and say you go out and buy healthcare on the open market, and that he is going to tax the value of that benefit that you get, which is not now taxed. Obama points out, and I think I agree with him, that the problem is that for a healthy person, a health plan costs a minimum of like $5,800, and for a family, it costs on an average about $12,000. So, in fact, is it a commitment to health care, or is it kind of cherry picking again to kind of drive a lot more people out of health care? Does anybody have any theories on this?
I wonder what the impact would be on the citizens that you serve, because one of the problems that I wrestle with both of these healthcare plans is for the person who is essentially using the city's emergency rooms and the subsidized healthcare. It hasn't seemed to me that it really adds much. And is that your perspective?
Well, I think, healthcare is a big issue in low-income communities, and I think that we all agree with that and know that it forces people that don't have health care to go to the emergency room for these costly fees, and they can't escape them. So I think that both candidates are presenting different perspectives on the healthcare system. I think that just to add to your point, Barack's plan, I think that he allows you to keep your employee-based health care if you have it, and it's fine, you're satisfied, but I think he's requiring that children are enrolled, but I'm not sure if the adults will have penalty. I think that we need some kind of federalized health care plan to help low-income people.
To help the uninsured.
Yeah, because you have,
40-something million people.
You have health care home attendants that are providing health services that don't have health care themselves.
Right. And this is one of the ways that I think that the Reagan Revolution has really continued to come back and bite states like New York that, in my opinion, have tried to do the right thing in providing health care access to people. And the federal government has just kept pushing that responsibility back down and back down and back down. So basically, here we are, strapped now, the market in desperate straits, our tax revenues decreasing, and no way to continue to fund that safety net, and not much help from the federal government.
One of the things that I covered David Dinkins' administration, and one of the things he did for precisely this problem of going to the emergency rooms was to create the Primary Care Development Corporation, specifically, in essence, a system of city-run clinics, which are cheaper as a means to provide health care than having people go to the emergency room for routine health care, which is the most expensive health care that there is. I want to try to get another question in.
Hi, good evening. My name is Saidi Pena. I currently attend John Jay College. I was just wondering, considering the whole financial crisis, how is immigration being addressed, and how is it going to affect it?
It's a very good question, because part of that question, I think, is to what degree will immigrants be scapegoated in a time of economic distress. I mean, do you have a sense of that?
Well, I think what we would have normally perhaps seen from out of the Republican playbook is a scapegoating of immigrants in this great time of economic distress. But because, to his credit, Senator McCain has been a very moderate, I think, reasonable voice on immigration coming out of the border state of Arizona, we really haven't seen the type of debate, discussion, and wide chasm between Senator Obama and Senator McCain on this issue. Ultimately, it's going to have to be something that we do confront as a nation, and hopefully, we'll find the will to be able to do it at some point in the next administration.
Do you have you deal, I'm sure, with large immigrant communities. Is there any heightened fear in a time of economic dislocation like this?
Yeah, people are afraid. They don't know what's going to happen. I think, when they hear close the borders, do this, you know, and restrict this, and you know, people are afraid, and you know, a big part of the immigrant population, you know, really serves a specific area of our workforce, and so I think that, you know, we really have to consider, you know, the things that we do and the inferences that we make towards immigrants. I mean, this country is made of immigrants, and I think that
well, this city has a higher percentage of its population as immigrants, kids of immigrants, than when my grandparents came here in 1910. So I mean, which was always viewed as the height of the immigrant experience. People's skins are a little darker, their accents are a little different, but they're essentially socioeconomically the same as my people. I actually don't think my people would have been able to get in here legally, right? You know. So I mean, it's always informed me. It's an issue that I've always felt very strongly about. There has been an absence of. You know, it could be that the economic implosion is so strong that the kind of scapegoating we've seen, I mean, this stuff about socialism and un-Americanism really hasn't grabbed hold because people are so obsessed with the economy. It's almost muted kind of the traditional scapegoating we've seen.
I think that's true, and we've had a lot more focus on what can we do to reverse the downward trend over time. We're going to come to realize that we have a very finite pool of dollars that we can use to deal with people in need, and we'll see to what extent we get competition. There have been a few stories in the paper, and I don't know how this is really playing out, about reverse immigration now.
People leaving.
As people
I'm going
leaving.
to, just because I got my 30-second notice, and I always make deadline, the one thing I do. I want you all to, as we say in Brooklyn, to make sure you vote early and often. And we will see you next time on the CUNY Forum. Thank you very much.